Okay, so in the final video of today's lectures, I just want to sort of get us into the concept of monetarism and basically the reemergence of what we now refer to as inflation hawks. So basically, in macro, you can sort of think of there being two different feelings on inflation. You have inflation hawks who are very, very concerned about inflation and sort of the thrust of their views of macroeconomics and certainly their policy preferences are really focused on keeping inflation down. And then you have inflation doves who I think admit that inflation can certainly be damaging if it goes beyond a certain point, but still sort of, I think, see the broader benefits of inflation, especially when it comes to things like wage growth, real wage growth in particular. And also sort of the understanding that sometimes you're going to have to experience a little bit of inflation if you want to keep unemployment down. And so those are sort of the kind of just two general schools of thought when it comes to inflation. Now, it may not be so surprising to you to learn that the inflation doves, as it were, are typically Keynesians, and the inflation hawks are the folks who we would put into the kind of post-Keynesian sort of synthesis, those being your monetarists, your real business cycle folks as well. Now, it's important to understand that this sort of movement to be concerned about inflation did not come out of thin air, of course, and in many ways. The sort of emergence of monetarism and the sort of post Keynesian synthesis makes a lot of sense when you look at the data. So here we have just in inflation essentially since the late 1960s all the way through to the early part of the 1980s. Now, what's important to understand about this particular era of inflation is that we have essentially never experienced this level of inflation before or since this particular event. That's important for the more kind of circumspect view of the so-called stagflation era of the United States, right? This is the stagflation era where we had both, as you can see in the graph, long and large spells of high inflation that also coincided with large and long spells of unemployment. You'll notice that during the stagflation era, we have a fairly sizable recession here from 74 to 75, and then two other recessions that weren't as big, but still obviously recessions. And you'll notice that preceding all of these recessions was this sort of uptick in inflation, right? So uptick in inflation and then a recession, right? Uptick in inflation and then a recession, uptick in inflation and then a recession. And then, of course, we have, this era here. This is that Volcker Fed that we've talked about before, the Volcker, recession, if you will. Now, in terms of monetarism, what you have to understand about this particular graph is that this sort of general trajectory of price level was very concerning. And then beyond it being very concerning, it was also at the time seen as vindication in many ways with the classical sort of quantity equation view of inflation, and in particular, sort of money supply. Because what you have during this era is a lot of monetary expansion. So, in particular, in the early part of the 1970s, the Federal Reserve under Arthur Burns takes on a very accommodating posture to the federal government. So, basically, what's going on in the late 60s, early 70s is a lot of fiscal expansion, Vietnam War, increases in domestic expenditure. Nixon doesn't want to lose the 72 election, so he's pumping a lot of fiscal expansion into the economy. And then he doesn't want that fiscal expansion to dry up. He wants that to continue boosting the economy. What he doesn't want is the Federal Reserve to come in and say, hey, we're worried about inflation, so therefore we're going to use contractionary monetary policy to, in a sense, tamp down this economic growth that you're trying to generate. Nixon, of course, didn't like this. And it's a really interesting kind of moment in American economic history where Nixon actually sort of lodges a PR campaign against Arthur Burns. And the way Arthur Burns talks about this particular era of his life is that it's clearly, it really wore on him. But from Nixon's perspective, it completely worked, because what we have is profligate monetary expansion in the early part of the 1970s all the way through. And so that profligate monetary expansion coinciding with profligate inflationary pressure made a lot of people lose faith in the sort of Keynesian argument, which was, yeah, inflation is problematic, but it's less of an issue than a lack of economic growth. And if you were someone who said, yeah, but inflation can cause recessions, then, you know, this recession here and this recession here in particular are, again, sort of vindications of that particular idea. So monetarism rises to the forefront of economic analysis because the 1970s were seen as a direct assault in many ways on the Keynesian approach. Now, you know, Keynesians would be very quick to point out that Keynes never would have suggested that you should have large-scale fiscal expansion alongside large-scale monetary expansion when the economy is already doing fairly well. So if you go back to 67 and 68, the economy is doing okay. There's some weakness there, but unemployment is quite low during this time period. And so to kind of further juice the economy is the classic overheating of the macroeconomy. So that inflation came after that is really of no surprise to the Keynesians of the world. And they would be quick to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not Keynesian policy. Keynesian policy says you manage aggregate demand when the economy is not doing well. The economy was pretty much okay in the late 60s. So continued fiscal expansion, continued monetary expansion, that's not really a sort of Keynesian argument. But the broader monetarist argument was that it wasn't just bad policy in the late 1960s. Their argument was really that all of this Keynesian policy, basically since World War II, was itself inflationary. And there had been folks who had sort of been predicting large inflation for a long time. And so when we saw that large inflation during the 1970s, it seemed to really validate a lot of those particular feelings, and for good reason. So now, monetarism, like what is it? Well, I've given you, I think, a nice setup here, but let's talk a little bit more about kind of what that all means ultimately for the policies that they would really suggest. So the main kind of criticism of monetarists upon Keynesians was that Keynesians seem to reject or maybe ignore that inflation was a monetary phenomenon, right? You get that classic inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, which famously Milton Friedman is known for sort of bringing back into vogue. You got to remember the quantity equation and the sort of Fisherian view of inflation and the money supply has been around a long time. This is Friedman resurrecting in many ways the quantity equation, which had lost its luster in the battle with Keynesianism. But I think more important to this, and I think one of the main reasons why I'm actually kind of teaching this section, despite the fact that monetarists have really kind of, in a sense, now we kind of see lost the battle to Keynesians into the future, of course, is that they did bring a really important idea, which I think is very important for us to have a conversation about, because so many people and fairly important economists feel very strongly that this is still a good idea. So they may not be sort of completely by the idea of monetarism, but in particular, this focus on sort of rules-based policy. That is many sort of the main kind of idea is that monetarists were very, very skeptical that policymakers could make efficient decisions. On the fiscal side, they really distrusted fiscal policy because they saw it as inherently inflationary, because they felt that policymakers always had an incentive to increase spending and cut taxes. So just, fiscal expansion, which of course even Keynesian ideas would suggest that is inflationary. So that was sort of the first thing. So they didn't really like fiscal policy at all, almost on principle. And then on the monetary policy side, the concern that Friedman had ultimately was that the central bank was going to end up having to take on this very defensive posture against a federal government that did not care about inflation. And then what he saw as the ultimate result of this was that when you start putting expectations into these models, now monetary policy and inflation, that becomes a much more convoluted process, because now inflation expectations are going to factor in monetary policy. So in a sense, what you have is this idea that whatever we expect in terms of monetary policy is ultimately the way the market is going to behave. So in the same way that we argued in terms of the Phillips curve and the expectations augmented Phillips curve, was that the inflation we tended to expect was the inflation that we got. A similar argument is made here, which is basically that the monetary policy that we expect, we end up behaving in such a way that almost creates that policy without us even making it. And that was what was one of Friedman's key ideas, was that monetary policy to him really didn't make a whole lot of sense, other than what he found was we should be targeting the money supply. And then basically what he believed is that, and folks who sort of developed these ideas kind of after him believed, is that not only should we target a particular money supply, but we should in fact target a money supply with respect to a particular rule, such that whatever the central bank and whoever was running the central bank at the time, they had to adhere to this particular rule. Friedman had a very sort of classical sort of sense that discretionary policy was inherently problematic. And I think Friedman just did not trust policymakers, in a sense, to do the right thing, or perhaps more problematically, to know what the right thing was, in fact, to even do. Another big idea that Friedman brings in that's really important is this argument about the so-called natural rate of unemployment. So Friedman brings back a very classical argument, which is essentially that wherever the unemployment is in the economic system, that is the natural rate. And if we go beyond the natural rate, basically, if we try to boost the economy through aggregate demand, the point there would be that we have some sort of unemployment gap. Right, we have unemployment is here. We want to reduce it, so we want to close the unemployment gap. And you'll see the gaps become a much more important part of the economic models that we look at sort of moving forward. So the idea would be is that, okay, let's try to close that particular gap. And of course, the Keynesian argument would be, let's close that gap with expansionary aggregate demand policy. Now, again, remember, Friedman doesn't like fiscal policy kind of writ large. And then he further doesn't like the sort of use of monetary policy here, because his belief is that if you signal that monetary policy, basically it's going to end up being washed out anyway, and such that your attempt to reduce unemployment belies a belief that the economy isn't itself efficient. And so, Friedman, again, has this classical sense. He thinks the economy tends to be efficient. So wherever the economy is, that's the natural rate. And any attempt to boost the economy from where it is now is going to lead to inflationary pressure, especially if you're attempting to use monetary policy to sort of get yourself there. So, what does Friedman mean ultimately when he says what the Fed should do is target a money supply? Well, what he said is he has this thing called the K% rule. Basically, he says the Fed should come up with a growth rate target of the money supply. Every year the Fed is essentially sort of adding to the money supply as the economy grows. It's sort of increasing liquidity into the system. Keynes thinks that makes a lot of sense. But what he does not necessarily believe is that the money supply should be actively used to pursue interest rate policy, right? That's a very Keynesian argument. We can move the money supply around to target a particular interest rate policy if we are trying to boost the economy or perhaps try to rein the economy in. Friedman doesn't like this. Friedman basically says that because there's so much expectations sort of pent up in the economic system, that any attempt to try to target an interest rate is, again, just going to simply get washed out by people's expectations. And that all you're ultimately going to end up doing is simply moving the price level around. Again, a very kind of classical sort of belief. And the big thing here that the sort of monetarists and then the folks who sort of extended monetarism really believed was that what you want to generate in your economy is inflation expectations. In other words, you want people to, in a sense, have a good idea of what inflation is going to be. Because if you live in a world where you think expectations about inflation generates inflation, then you want to give people the expectation that you want in terms of inflation. So basically, one of Friedman's kind of interesting arguments is that inflation policy has to be done through the consumer, through the money markets. So whatever the inflation you want to have, the only way you can ever actually get that is by targeting a particular money supply. And as he put it, avoid those discretionary destabilizing errors. So again, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, the thing about Friedman is that he very much, like a lot of sort of center-right economists, has been sort of co-opted into this sort of like quote unquote right-wing view of the macroeconomy. And it's true that sort of more right-wing economy. Oh, okay, we're back. Sorry about that. My Zoom crashed. Been lucky, that hasn't happened too much this summer term. It's a shame too, because I was like almost completely done. Anyway, to sort of completely wrap this sort of idea up, is that the sort of sense that Keynes had is that if you pursue a monetary policy that targets interest rates, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to target investment levels. And in his opinion, that was a fool's errand. That any attempt to encourage or discourage investment through interest rate policy would simply just get washed out and then eventually just add to inflationary or deflationary pressure, right? And again, Friedman's big thing is we want to target inflation through targeting of the money supply. And so this idea that the interest rate becomes a policy tool is something that Keynes really largely rejects. And in the sense that he rejects it, it's because he doesn't think that monetary policy should necessarily be discretionary. Now, you could argue, of course, that the money supply ends up being a discretionary idea in the same way that interest rates are discretionary. I think Friedman would have argued that interest rates become, in a sense, more discretionary, ultimately because what you're doing is you are imposing upon markets your view on the level of investment. And that's not what Friedman's arguing. Friedman's arguing you shouldn't even worry about the level of investment. Let the economy decide how much investments it wants. What you should simply do is make sure that the economy has enough, but not too much liquidity. And where too much liquidity is, we get too much, quote unquote, inflation. And then again, this is where you get that natural rate of unemployment. So Friedman's sort of labor market argument is that the natural rate of unemployment will be the unemployment that we have, where any less unemployment is going to cause inflation, right? And so sort of Friedman's argument is ultimately that you have an inflation target. That inflation target belies a sort of particular trade-off between unemployment and the money supply. And in particular, Friedman would argue that you should be, in a sense, more worried about the money supply than the unemployment. Is sort of one of the key arguments. So target the money supply with rules-based monetary policy is the sort of broad theme of monetarism. And we'll see that play out in models moving forward.